To say that once again we have Leith van Onselen, rightly called the unconventional economist because he speaks common sense, which we all understand, and he comes from macrobusiness.com.au. Leith, would it still, and certainly welcome to the program.
Thanks, David.
Leith, would it be still true to say, from the point of view of an economist, are we still the lucky country?
Yes and no. So obviously, look, Australia is still a great country. We have a lot of natural advantages. The fact that I guess it's an advantage and disadvantage, but the fact that we're so far away from, the rest of the world means that we are isolated to an extent from, refugee arrivals just pouring in over the border like they got in the United States at the moment and other places in Europe, etc. We obviously have a lot of natural advantages in that we're still got a relatively small population, 27 million people on a gigantic continent, effectively, with a lot of mineral wealth. So that obviously is an advantage. And we obviously have, great weather and, still high living standards. The problem is we're doing our best to undermine that. Unfortunately, our politicians are. They've managed to, at least on the east coast of Australia, engineer an energy crisis, despite the fact that we're an energy superpower. So we end up paying some of the highest gas and electricity prices in the world, despite the fact that we export, the overwhelming majority of our gas and our coal, etc., which is just a complete own goal. And those high energy costs are obviously not just hurting households and the cost of living and pushing up inflation, but they're also contributing to Australia's decline in manufacturing and export competitiveness in other areas, outside of minerals. And as a result, Australia has the smallest share of manufacturing in the OECD. And then at the same time, we're obviously making the great Australian dream of home ownership harder because we're importing record numbers of people into our capital cities. And that's pushing up the cost of housing, both prices and rents, and obviously adding to congestion concerns and livability concerns left, right, and centre. So we are still very lucky, which is, I guess, why so many people want to come here. But we are doing our best to undermine that. And I'll just add one final point, David. When you are when you hold such immense mineral wealth like Australia does, and we don't tax it properly, and we give ourselves expensive energy, despite that, one thing you certainly don't want to do when you have such mineral wealth is to continually expand the population so aggressively, because all you end up doing is diluting that mineral wealth over more people, which then makes you poorer per capita. And I've no doubt that Australia would be a far richer country if we had around 20 million people like we did at the turn of the century. We actually had 19 million back then. Then our current situation where we have 27 million people and growing quickly, and then projected to go to over 40 million by 2060. So, yes, we're lucky, but we're becoming less lucky.
At the turn of the previous century, with federation, according to the statistics I've looked at, we were the second richest country on a per capita basis in the world.
With Argentina, I think it was.
Yes, and now we're the 20th, and we seem to be slipping all the time, slipping down the list, which seems extraordinary when we're endowed with such wealth.
Yeah, it is. And it's kind of unfortunate. I mean, it's sort of unnecessary. And I often draw the comparison between us and the Scandinavian nations. So, for example, the Scandinavian nations, if you look at, say, Sweden. So Sweden back in 1960 had a population of about, I think it was 10 million people. And I think it was 8 million people, but it was pretty similar to Australia. And all the Scandinavian nations, their populations in 2060 are only about a quarter less than what they are now. So in that 50-odd year period, or nearly 60-year period, the Scandinavian nations have grown their population by about 25%. Whereas in Australia, we've grown ours by 170% in that time. We're about 10 million people in 1960. So, I sort of look at what they've done. I think, well, isn't that a smarter policy, smarter approach? Especially Australia's probably most closely similar to, say, Norway, because Norway has immense oil and gas reserves. Norway is far poorer now, if it had grown its population like we have by 170% rather than 25% since 1960, because they're spreading that mineral wealth over, way more people, obviously. And Norway is also intelligent in that they tax their mineral wealth properly, so they're now sitting on a sovereign wealth fund that's worth about $240,000 per citizen, US dollars per citizen, which we could have done something like that with our mineral wealth, but we didn't. We basically haven't gained from our mineral wealth, and in fact, because we've delivered ourselves expensive energy, we've actually made ourselves worse off and less competitive.
So you've pointed really to two things. We haven't developed a sovereign wealth fund like the Norwegians. We also haven't, at least on the East Coast, had a reservation policy, a domestic reservation policy, as they do, I think, in WA, and most other countries in the world who have mineral wealth have a reservation policy, so that, for example, in Qatar, they don't pay over the world price for their petrol. And that seems to me to be there seems to be something wrong with the political decisions that are taken in Australia.
Yeah.
Are we too
Unfortunately
pure?
so, David. I don't know. It's kind of crazy. So, and look, it's both sides of government are at fault with this. Obviously, under the Henry Tax Review, the Rudd-Gillard government tried to bring in a mining tax, which was, it was imperfect, but it was a tax that would have gotten us some more taxation on the mineral wealth. The coalition, the media, the mining lobby rallied against it. We got that overturned, which is stupid. At the same time, the previous government, the Rudd-Gillard government, back in just before the coalition got elected in 2013, refused to implement domestic gas reservation on the Gladstone LNG terminal. So basically, prior to that period on the East Coast, Australia's gas prices weren't leaked to the global market because we didn't have any gas export facilities. And then what happened was I like to call them the gas cartel, because we've got a very, handful of companies that control the nation's gas. They decided that it was a great idea to build these export terminals up in Gladstone, Queensland, so they could liquefy gas, send it overseas, mostly to China. And the Rudd-Gillard government at the time was against requiring them to reserve gas for domestic use like they do in Western Australia. So they completely stuffed it up. And as a result now, about 80% of our East Coast gas gets exported, most of it to China. And what it's basically done is it's weakened domestic price of the global market. And it's actually worse than that, because a lot of the long-term contracts that China has with Australia, they get very, very cheap gas. Now, some of that's with Western Australian gas, but they might pay, say, $4 a gigajoule, whereas up on the East Coast now we're paying $12. And we were before, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we were paying up to like $40. So we're sort of in this bizarre situation where we are one of the world's largest exporters of gas. We've got oodles of it, but we're paying some of the highest prices in the world, and that feeds into your electricity, because gas is the firming fuel for electricity. So what that means is, when your renewable energy and your baseload energy, when you don't have enough of that to supply your electricity grid, gas is the fallback option, because a gas turbine can be turned on instantly and it provides you the backup power. And the problem with it is, because we're shifting away from coal towards renewables are great when they work. It's made the power supply a bit more intermittent. So obviously for renewable power, it's very cheap. It's obviously clean. So I'm actually a big fan of it. Problem is, you need obviously the wind to blow, you need the sun to shine. And when you don't have those two things, you need a backup. And the backup is gas, because gas can be turned on instantly. Problem is, we've made that backup, which we're actually more reliant on now than ever, but made that so expensive that basically electricity prices have gone through the roof as well. So we've had this dual price shock of rising gas prices. So if you're a Victorian, you heat your homes in winter. Most Victorians use gas for the heat. Your gas charge for your home goes up heaps, so they cost you a lot more money. If you're a business that uses gas, so manufacturer, etc., you're paying way more. But then we're also getting the double hit of higher electricity prices. because gas sets the electricity price as well through this firming action. So we've just got this diabolical situation, and it could be fixed very easily with the stroke of a pen. All we need to do is reserve the gas prices, just basically copy what Western Australia does. And ideally, tax mineral wealth better so that we don't have to continually ratchet up taxes on workers, which is what we do. And we could shift the tax base towards resources like they do in Norway, and we'd be a lot better off.
One of the things I've noticed in the news is that our nickel industry seems to be in great difficulty, great problems, and the Indonesians have done very well. And they seem to have done well because, firstly, they had a reservation policy. It wasn't a reservation, it was just a ban on export, so that people were forced to develop the Indonesian nickel industry. Then they allowed exports, but they, as I understand it, they used Australian coal to produce electricity rather than renewables, so that their electricity costs are much cheaper and more reliable than Australia's. And they've developed an industry which seems to be running rings around us.
Yeah, look, I'm actually a fan of renewables, but only if you have the cheap gas as the backup, right? So renewables are fine, and they are cheap when they work. So when solar's going, you can actually have negative electricity prices. When the sun's out and there's abundance at that moment. Problem is, if you don't have battery storage and you don't have any way to store that power, it's only good while they're running. So while the wind's blowing and you've got the sun, you can have enough electricity and it can be fairly cheap. It's all those other times, which is night times when the wind's not blowing, when you need the backstop, or winter time when the sun's basically, in Melbourne, you have solar's useless in winter because we've got such little sunshine. So if we had a situation whereby we built out renewables, that's fine, but you need to have the cheap gas as a backstop. And we've got enormous amounts of gas here. There's no reason why we can't do that. But we've got to make it cheap enough so that that firming power that has to kick in when renewables isn't working is cheap. And did those, if you simply fix the gas market, you could effectively fix Australia's energy crisis and also deliver cheap electricity. And you can actually shut down the coal-fired power plant. That wouldn't be a problem. But you have to have enough gas and you have to make it cheap enough to do it. Because gas is cheaper than coal. Is cleaner than coal. And that's effectively what the US has done. So the US has lowered their carbon emissions by basically replacing coal with gas, and as well as renewables. And it's worked, but they're not stupid like us. So the US is actually the largest now. It's overtaken Australia as being the largest gas exporter in the world. At the same time, it's got incredibly cheap domestic prices because it allows exports, but at the same time, it reserves domestic gas. So it's delivered a double dividend. It's got cheap energy domestically because it reserved its gas. It's made it cheap. But at the same time, it's also exporting, so it's making money there. In Australia, we export it. We don't tax the exporters, so we don't get the gains from that, and it just goes to private companies mostly. And then we don't reserve it, so they ram up the domestic price, which just means all households and businesses pay more. So, the renewable thing's fine, but only if you've got the cheap gas as the backstop, because you need that firming power and it's got to be affordable, and we don't have that.
I'm speaking to Leith Van Onselen, and we'll break for an announcement.